Everybody, this is your Monday's RE lesson sent from Miss Potter and Miss Sampson, and today we are going to be looking at somebody really famous. You might have heard of him, Mahatma Gandhi. So he was born in 1869, which is quite a while ago now. And it's still strange how famous he is today because he did something really, really special. So Mahatma Gandhi was born on the 2nd of October 1869. He was born in Porbandar in Gujarat, northwest India. His father was the chief minister of Porbandar, so that he was like in charge, and his mother was highly religious. So he came from a very religious, probably quite high up family. She worshipped the god Vishnu, but also believed in the Jain teachings of mutual tolerance and not causing injury to living things. So that was their religion that they were born into. Gandhi was born into a privileged caste and therefore received a good education. So he came from quite a well-off family, so they could afford to take him to school. At the age of 13, Gandhi had an arranged marriage to a girl who was also 13, called Kasturbai Makhanji. Interesting name. So can you imagine that at 13, so only 3 years from how old you are now, they were arranged to get married. So not through love, but through their family just arranging them to get married. Just like what we looked at in the Tudors of how they arranged to get married to keep wealth and education within the family. His first son of 4 was born in 1888 when Gandhi was 18 years old and a student at Samaldas College. So he had his first baby when he was 18 years old whilst he was still a student. So he was only married for 5 years before he had his first baby. He was not very happy at college. He was offered the chance to study law in London. He took it, so he didn't really like it there and he decided that he was going to move to London. He worked hard and began to study all of religions until the time he had never really been interested in religion. So he wasn't really that bothered, and then he decided to start studying, and that's when he sparked his interest. He came back from London and returned to India, and he found it really hard to find work. So eventually, he went to South Africa. So in South Africa, apartheid was in force in South Africa, and they're not a very nice type of people. They weren't treating people very well. Gandhi was horrified at the way people who were not white were being treated. So similarly, what we were looking at when we were doing Hidden Figures, that it wasn't very equal, that black people were treated a lot worse than the white people were. On one occasion, Gandhi was removed from a train purely because he was not white. So at that time, South Africa was a really white country that dominated. The white people dominated the country, and the black people and any other race people, because obviously Gandhi was from India, they just weren't treated fairly, and it was not very nice, and they didn't get much money and they didn't get the good jobs, just like we looked at a few months ago during our space topic. And another time he was asked to remove his turban by a European magistrate, so again probably by a white person, and he refused and he left the courtroom. So obviously that's because he was doing something to do with law. They asked him to remove his turban, which is part of his religion. So that's really, really disrespectful to him and to his religion, which is why he probably refused. So apartheid is in the glossary, and I'm really glad because even I struggle with what this one means. It's an African word that means status of being apart. So obviously, in real life terms, it's meant that white people were treated a lot better than black or Asian people. There were even shops that non-whites weren't allowed to go into. So very similarly, like we looked at the black and whites in the 1940s to the 1960s, about them being separated, about going to different schools, going to different restaurants and cinemas and different places. That was really similar in South Africa at that time, that they weren't allowed to do same things. So Gandhi and his politics. Gandhi started a political movement called the Natal Indian Congress, and he believed that it was a non-violent political protest. So he didn't hurt anybody. He wanted it to just speak volumes as being really calm and really just wanting to get his voice heard. He returned to India in 1916 and was horrified to find out how oppressed the Indian people of Bihar were by the white British masters. So oppressed means that they weren't equal. So similarly, what he found in South Africa, he found in his home country of India, that the Indian people weren't being treated fairly, and the white British people were being in charge of them, not being very fair. And he began to encourage people to stand up for themselves and their rights in peaceful protests and strikes. So he began to say, no, we shouldn't stand up for this. It's not fair. So he encouraged them to become stronger and be their own person and stand up for their own self. And the people were grateful that somebody was interested in their situation, and he became known as Mahatma, meaning great soul. So he obviously became some form of leader in their eyes. He became quite famous throughout India, and his fame spread throughout the whole country. Indian people saw him as a voice of freedom and fairness, because obviously they were not being treated fairly at all. So he started to boycott of buying British goods. So that means because the British people were in charge of India at that time, he said, no, we shouldn't buy from them. They're not treating us fairly. So let's buy from other Indian people so they don't get as much money. This meant he encouraged people not to buy anything that was made in Britain. But meant that he got arrested for that on the 2nd of March in 1922, and he was put in prison for 2 years, not for really doing a crime, not for hurting anybody, but for just simply encouraging somebody not to buy an item from somebody who's from Britain. And this went on that when he was in prison, Gandhi went on many hunger strikes to bring attention to the unfair treatment of Indian people at the hands of the British. So when he was in prison, he just simply refused to eat as a protest, so he wasn't hurting anybody but himself, to say that the Indian people were not being treated fairly. And this probably parallels because the Indian people weren't probably eating fairly either, because they were a lot poorer than the British. So he was probably trying to symbolize by him not eating, it replicates the Indian people not eating, because the British are taking charge and stealing a lot of the food and the wealth of India. So we have the Salt March, which is where it really began. So when he was released 2 years later, he began a campaign to end the British rule of Indian people. So at that point, Britain was in charge of India, which meant all the white people that came over from Britain could rule over the Indian people, even though it was really the Indian people's country. And Gandhi did not like this, along with most of the Indian people as well. They were treated very unfairly. So in 1930, the British introduced a tax on salt, and this hit the poorest people the most. In protest, Gandhi marched 250 miles to the sea to get his own salt from the ocean, and thousands of Indian people joined him on his march, and 60,000 people were arrested, including Gandhi. So because the British retaliated to Gandhi to say, no, we don't think you should be treated fairly, I don't agree, we are going to introduce a tax on salt, which means when you drink or when you eat or when you have and order salt, it's going to be a lot more expensive. And obviously salt is quite a staple thing for most people in their foods, especially in India, they used it a lot. So they couldn't afford to have it anymore, which meant some people could go starving, or they couldn't eat it anymore. They couldn't eat certain foods. So Gandhi obviously did not agree to this. So in protest, he marched 250 miles, which is such a long way, just to get his own salt from the sea. It wasn't really about the salt, it was more in protest against the British. There is a link on this slide. Obviously, you can't get to it right now from YouTube, but if you go back on Dojo, it will be attached for you to have a look a little bit more at the Salt March and what that entailed. And then we've got this bit about civil unrest. So when the Second World War broke out at the beginning of the 1940s, Indian men were fighting for the British people, because at that point, Britain was in charge of India. So Britain were at war with Germany, and they decided, well, we own India, so let's bring lots of Indian men over and they can fight for us. And Gandhi, along with lots of other Indian people, did not see why they should be treated that way. It's not fair. Why should they fight for a country that doesn't treat them very kindly? And lots of people agreed with him because he was arrested for encouraging people to rise up against Indian men fighting for the British. He did not agree with it. And he spent another 2 years in prison in a place called Pune. Sadly, his wife was also held there. So his wife, at the time, who he married when he was 13, was with him when he was doing all these protests, and she agreed with everything he was saying. And she was taken to prison as well. But sadly, she died in the prison. Not long before Gandhi was released. So obviously they were separated when they went to prison. They couldn't see each other, and then she died there, which is really, really sad. So, because Gandhi was so well known throughout India for his protests and for his stands on what he believed, not everybody agrees with him. Not everyone had the same beliefs as him. There were 6 times when somebody tried to assassinate him. So he was always wanting to be killed by people, and he was always trying to be followed by people. So there's lots of people that agreed with him and wanted to be with him in his protest, and lots of people that did not agree and didn't like the fuss he was causing. So one man called Nathuram Godse was a Hindu, and he didn't believe the same things as Gandhi. So he didn't believe in the equality that Gandhi was trying to produce. So he tried to kill him lots of times. Eventually, on the 30th of January 1948, Gandhi was assassinated on his way to go to a prayer meeting in Delhi. He was shot 3 times in the chest, so he wasn't killed in a nice way at all, and he was killed by somebody who didn't agree with him, so he was assassinated. So allegedly, his dying words were, so as he was on the street, obviously, after being shot, Hey Ram, which means, oh God. So obviously he was quite a religious man, and then maybe that's what he was thinking about for his last thoughts before he died. So the Nobel Peace Prize is an award that is given out in throughout the world to anybody that has made a massive difference. And Gandhi's body was cremated, and the ashes are kept in the palace in Pune, where he was kept a prisoner. So they've kind of turned around their idea of, well, they hated him at the beginning for all of what he did and for his protest, but now they actually like worship him and they think he was a great guy. So his ashes are kept there as a reminder of what he went through as a prisoner. He was nominated 5 times for a Nobel Peace Prize, but he never actually got it. However, in the year of his death, he was nominated, and the prize was not awarded to anybody because that was the year he was going to receive it. And they said they shouldn't give it to anybody because there was no one suitable who is a candidate that is living. So that was when it was meant to go to him. So unfortunately, he died before he received his prize. His birthday is now a national holiday in India. So obviously he is very celebrated and looked upon as a amazing man throughout the world, but for India, for standing up for Indians people's rights. He's got quite a lot of famous quotes, but one of the most famous he has is an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind, which I really like because a lot of people say, oh, if something happens to me, I should fight them back, and a lot of retaliation. But he's saying, no, we should stop. It doesn't mean that just because something happens to me, somebody does something nasty to me, that I should do something nasty to them, because it just gives more hurt into the world. It's like the saying, don't fight fire with fire, it just causes more fire. And it's exactly the same. He doesn't want to retaliate. As you can see from the whole of these slides, he was never a violent man. He did a lot of peaceful protests. He wanted to prove that you didn't have to have violence to have your voice heard. And I think he's a really good candidate to show people that if you do things silently, you are more loud in the world's eyes rather than just being violent and causing harm. So I think that's a really nice message to finish this on. So your task for today is to design a poster, okay? So it's quite a nice, easy one. So everything that you've learned today about what I've told you about Mahatma Gandhi. So You can grab a normal A4 piece of paper. It can be in your book, so you can do it on the lines of the A4, or if you've got a plain white piece of paper, you can do it on that as well. And you are going to design a poster on some of the things that I've talked about today. So this could be an image of him that I want you to include, maybe in the middle, maybe at the top, so you can grab a picture of him. Some of the key information that I talked about, so his birth and death and his marriages, and those key dates that we look at. Some facts about his life, so maybe how he moved to London and then how he went to Africa for a while and he didn't like what he saw between the black and the white civil unrest, and then what he did in India. So why he became famous in India, so starting with that salt march and protesting against things that he didn't believe. I want that last famous quote in there somewhere. Remember to use quote marks, so that can be on your poster. And then I also want how he was killed, because how he was assassinated is obviously not very nice, but considering he was trying to be assassinated over 6 times, people just, it shows how much that people did not like him, but in respect, he didn't really care. He didn't hide away and hide from them. He faced them and he said that everybody can have an opinion and everyone's opinion is valid, but he was just making his opinion louder and he was standing up for people that necessarily didn't get their voices heard. So you can have a look back through the slides and through this video to help you, and you can pause it along the way. If you've got some colours at home, it would be really nice to make it all decorative, kind of like this PowerPoint. There's some nice flowers at the back, which are the Indian flower for peace. And that stands for Gandhi quite well because he stood for peace and he stood for equality. So I think there's some nice colours and some nice other images that you could add to your poster to make it stand out. Okay, can't wait to see them. Upload them to this task on Dojo, please.